Welcome back to The Price of Business. I'm your host, Kevin Price, talking to you about you and your business. Going to chat with my friend, Brian Domitrovic. He is a professor and chairman of the history department at Sam Houston State University and a regular contributor on The Price of Business. He writes for Forbes, author of many books, editor of even more books, and always glad to talk to him and to get his unique economic historian perspective. By the way, I'm curious to get your PhD is in economic history, correct?
It's in history, and I also did a field in graduate school in the economics department. But the PhD is in history itself. In history,
what area of history?
I actually wrote on intellectual history. I wrote a thesis on actually the left in the 20th century who argued, the left used to argue this, that economic growth was becoming so huge that we would have to spend most of our time in leisure in the future. That's actually what the Marxists used to argue. And I kind of investigated their claims about that. If that's so, then they should be very in favor of economic growth and capitalist production. And it's funny, the old left very much was of that opinion.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's still some of them that talk about that. Who will be the last man still working? That kind of almost humorous look at that type of thing. And it's interesting. The reality is that I think we are always underestimating the desire of desire when it comes to money. I always think that we'll always be trying to figure out the next new thing to improve the quality of our lives. The reality is that even poor Americans live better than monarchs, a few centuries ago, or not even centuries ago, a century plus ago. And so America, it's an interesting thing to see what an economy can do for people.
Yeah, one of my professors in graduate school was David Landis, the greatest historian of the Industrial Revolution, and he wrote a great book called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations. And he began that book with a story of Jacob Rothschild, who had a little boil on his back in 1836. And he started summoning doctors from his home in Frankfurt, Germany, and then in concentric circles all around Europe, and then all over the world he brought in these doctors. And they could not solve the problem, and he died. The thing is that this poorest child in Africa gets this boil problem solved today at a clinic, no problem. And in 1836, Jacob Rothschild was the richest man in the world. So, just the difference in standards of living because of the Industrial Revolution over the last 150, 75 years have been profound.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And you're talking about Marxist theory a little bit there. Also I think, I've read into this, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this. I even wrote about this in my book, Empowerment to the People. I think that, the Marxist worldview about wealth is that wealth is static, whereas we believe in dynamic views of wealth. And I wonder if some of the obvious built-in entropy when it comes to the economy that certain policies have are designed to slow wealth utilization and wealth creation as a way of wealth conservation. What do you think about that?
Well, Kevin, I think that's what's going on with the Democrats and the progressives today. Suddenly they're opposed to economic growth. It's not a big value. Now, I'm talking the Marxists. Karl Marx himself and Friedrich Engels back in the 19th century, they wanted capitalism, the capitalist mode of production as they talked about it, to produce economic growth like had never been seen before. And then they said, then we're going to take it over and distribute it. But they said there's no way you can have economic growth and there's no way you can have high living standards for the masses unless capitalism delivers it first. That was Marx's position, no questions asked.
Interesting. So you can't do it without the capitalists. We just have to, or without a capitalistic model. We just have to enslave it.
Yeah, no, that was Marx's position. So it's funny to see the progressives say, we don't really need economic growth. Don't we? Everyone agreed that we needed economic growth, from those who were in favor of the laissez-faire system to those who wanted to take it over through violent revolution.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So what are you talking about these days? I know you're getting ready to make your big trip to Colorado for the next year to do a very special program up there as a visiting scholar. But what kind of things are you talking about and writing about over at your Forbes column?
Yeah, well, right now I'm writing about a couple of things. I've been asked to write a kind of futuristic prediction of what the economy will look like 50 years from now. And, of course, that's taking me back 50 years because I'm a historian. 50 years ago was 1965. The funny thing about 1965 is it really was the apex of post-war prosperity. It's probably the apex, the pinnacle of American prosperity in general. The United States was growing at 6% per year that year for the fourth straight year. Inflation was 1%. Federal spending had actually gone down, even in nominal terms, from the year before. And it was after 1965 that we started to see the slow erosion of the tradition of economic growth that has really held, despite the 1980s and 1990s, to this day. And so I'm trying to extrapolate. Well, if you were in 1965, you would say, oh, it's just going to get better and better and better and better. And, we suffered after 1965 for 5 decades. And so I'm going to try to extrapolate what's going to happen over the next 5 decades.
Yeah, that's interesting. Any ideas?
Yeah, well, it's pretty clear what happened after 1965. The government got jealous of the private sector. I mean, when you think about it, if the private sector is growing at 6% per year, over a decade, it's going to grow at 70%. Say you do that for 2 decades, and government is shrinking, as it was from 1964 to 1965. Government will quickly become irrelevant. The nation will be its own. It will be unformed by government. And government gets scared by that. That's called an existential crisis. We're not going to exist anymore. So what government does, like a disease, it tries to figure out how to slow the growth of the private sector so it can remain relevant.
Right. Wow, that's an interesting concept. You're saying that the market could certainly become so dynamic to essentially make the bureaucracy itself irrelevant.
That's what we were staring at in 1965. You have that trend hold of 6% private sector growth and negative growth of the government. You have that hold for a decade or two. Bye-bye government.
Yeah, and that's an interesting year because that was 1 year after the Kennedy tax cuts that was shepherded by Lyndon Johnson, proving, in fact, that a rising tide does lift all boats.
Yeah, that's the book Larry Kudlow and I are writing right now, and that's what has gotten me so fascinated about this topic. I mean, this tax cut and the stable money, the reassertion of the gold standard associated with it, just let the private sector run like never before, way more than it had in the 1950s. And it's interesting that we had then the rise of the welfare state and then tax increases to kind of break the momentum of the private economy, and the big beneficiary was government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Of course, you advocate the opposite. Tax cuts should beget more tax cuts, right?
Yeah.
Because government should need less revenue because of the fact that it's going to generate more revenue in the short run. Really, what you're talking about is like a Walmart approach to taxation. Walmart makes less money per product than any retail company out there, yet it has larger revenues than any retail company out there. Why? Because of the volume of its activity. That could be the same way in our taxes, couldn't it?
No question about it. The logic of the Laffer curve. If you cut taxes, the economy needs the government less and less because it's taking care of its own business more and more. And yet revenue increases to the government because of the Laffer curve. So you have to keep cutting taxes. Now, that means the government's going to effectively have to go out of business, so it has to be cool with that. People in government are like, okay, I'm going to cycle into the private sector, and that's good. But they have to be of that mentality. They have to have the correct character to understand it's time for government to fold.
Yeah, no question about it. And that would really require a paradigm shift in who we bring, into the White House.
Yeah, I think we have to stop lionizing public service. I think we have to start, like we did in the 19th century, seeing work in the government as something regrettable, something that one should only pursue as a last resort, that one can only really find fulfillment in work outside of the government. I think that's the kind of old 19th century attitude we have to start cultivating in this country.
Yeah, I think you're right. Absolutely. Probably. I think that's an interesting take on it. I think there's a lot of people. What's interesting is that all these socially liberal young people on so many different fronts are very intrigued with enterprise in a way we hadn't seen in generations. It is kind of interesting.
That is so impressive. I mean, in biotech and all these kind of wearable devices, I mean, people are just running with it. What's just disconcerting, I talk to my friends at the Pacific Research Institute, where the Laffer Center is located in San Francisco, and they say, the one disconcerting thing is a lot of these tech guys also then try to get sweetheart deals with the government. I mean, I'm afraid Elon Musk, our friend, is the best example of this, always trying to shake down the government. Look how good these great tech things I'm doing. Would you please give me a tax abatement or a special subsidy? So I really hope that those captains of the tech industry remain true to their principles and try to really keep government at bay.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Brian Domitrovic, always a great guest on The Price of Business. And you can find him very easily. If you put in Brian Domitrovic, Domitrovic, into any search engine, he pops up very prominently. I love his stuff at Forbes. One day I'm going to just have you on, and we're going to go right down the line looking at your Forbes pieces. You do a great job there, and a great job making a difference. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Kevin.
All right, when we come back, much more for you. I do want to remind you the show continues 24/7 at priceofbusiness.com. And this is The Price of Business.